Imagine standing on a blood-soaked battlefield, the air thick with screams, the clash of bronze against bronze echoing across the desert. You are an Egyptian archer, your bow drawn, your heart pounding. Before you marches the most powerful army the world has ever seen. 10,000 Persian immortals, their spears glinting like a forest of death in the merciless sun. Your fingers tremble on the bowstring. You have trained your entire life for this moment. One shot, one perfect shot could turn the tide, could save your kingdom, could preserve 3,000 years of civilization, but you cannot release. Because there, painted on every Persian shield, staring at you with divine eyes, is the sacred image of Bastet, the cat goddess, your goddess. And walking before the enemy infantry, driven forward by whips and spears, stumbling over the sand in confused terror, are hundreds of living cats, sacred creatures, divine manifestations of the gods themselves. To fire would be to condemn your soul to eternal damnation. To spare them is to watch your nation die. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This nightmare was real. This was the Battle of Pelusium, 525 BC. The day the ancient world learned that faith could be weaponized, that culture could be turned into a blade sharper than any sword. The day cats conquered Egypt. What allegedly happened on that blood-drenched delta, recorded by ancient writers like Polyaenus, changed warfare forever. It ended 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. It proved that the mind could be more powerful than the strongest fortress, and it revealed a terrifying truth that echoes through history to this very moment. Your deepest beliefs, your most sacred values, can become the weapon that destroys you. This is the story of how one man saw into the soul of an empire and turned everything Egyptians loved against them. This is the story of the most psychologically brutal battle ever fought. This is the day Egypt fell not to strength, but to its own devotion. If you want to see more brutal truths about the wars that shaped our world, hit that like button and subscribe to Wars in History. Ring the bell so you never miss a video. We dive deep into the strategies, the psychology, and the raw human cost of history's most pivotal conflicts. Now, let's descend into the nightmare of Pelusium. The year is 525 BC. The ancient world stands on a precipice. For 3,000 years, Egypt has endured. Through invasions, through famines, through the rise and fall of dynasties, the land of the pharaohs has remained. The pyramids, already ancient beyond comprehension, tower over the desert as monuments to an unbroken civilization. The Nile floods with perfect regularity, bringing life to the black soil that feeds millions. The temples of Karnak and Luxor echo with hymns sung for millennia. Egypt is eternal. Egypt is divine. Egypt cannot fall, except it is about to. To the east, a new power has risen, a power unlike anything the world has seen. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, forged in blood and iron by Cyrus the Great, stretches from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. It has consumed Lydia, conquered Babylon, subjugated the proud kingdoms of Asia Minor. Every nation that stood before it has fallen. Every king who defied it has been broken. And now the Persians turn their gaze toward Egypt. The Persian army is not merely numerous, it is a machine. A perfectly organized instrument of conquest built on the revolutionary administrative genius of Cyrus. Unlike the chaotic levies of previous empires, the Persian military is professional, disciplined, and supplied by the wealth of a dozen conquered nations. At its heart are the immortals, 10,000 elite warriors so named because their number never diminishes. When one falls, another immediately takes his place. They are the finest soldiers in the world. They have never known defeat. Leading this unstoppable force is Cambyses II, son of Cyrus, heir to an empire that spans continents. He is young, ambitious, and he has something to prove. His father conquered the known world. What is left for the son except to surpass him? Egypt is the prize. Egypt is the final jewel, the land of gold and grain, of ancient wisdom and mysterious power. If Cambyses can conquer Egypt, his name will echo through eternity, but Egypt is no easy prey. The 26th dynasty, also called the Sate dynasty, has ruled Egypt for nearly a century and a half. They came to power after freeing Egypt from Assyrian domination, and they have worked tirelessly to restore Egyptian greatness. Under Pharaoh Psamtik II, Egypt has known prosperity. The Nile Delta is perhaps the richest agricultural region on earth. 20,000 inhabited cities dot the landscape. Trade with Greece has brought wealth and cultural exchange. Greek mercenaries, the finest soldiers gold can buy, serve in Egyptian ranks. Psamtik II is shrewd, diplomatic, and deeply aware of the Persian threat. For years he has watched the Persian Empire expand, consuming kingdom after kingdom. He has signed treaties, paid tributes, sent gifts. He has done everything possible to avoid what he knows is inevitable. But in 526 BC, Psamtik dies. He dies in his bed of natural causes at an advanced age. He dies peacefully. He dies having never faced the Persian storm. That fate falls to his son. Psamtik III ascends to the throne of the two lands. He is young. He is inexperienced. He has ruled for perhaps 6 months when word comes that the Persians are marching, that Cambyses himself, at the head of the largest army Egypt has ever faced, is coming across the Sinai, that the end has begun. Psamtik does what he can. He musters the army. He calls upon the Greek mercenaries. He fortifies Pelusium, the gateway to Egypt, the fortress city that guards the eastern approaches to the Nile Delta. He prays to the gods. He offers sacrifices. He consults the priests. And then comes the omen. In Thebes, 600 miles to the south, where such a thing has not occurred in living memory, where the desert climate makes it almost impossible, rain falls. Heavy rain. Unnatural rain. The priests are horrified. Rain in Thebes is a sign of divine anger, a portent of catastrophe. The gods have turned their faces away from Egypt. Psamtik hears the news in Memphis. He is surrounded by advisors, by generals, by priests all arguing about strategy, about where to make a stand, about whether to defend the delta or withdraw to the interior. And now this. Rain in Thebes. The gods themselves proclaiming Egypt's doom. He is young and inexperienced. He has been pharaoh for only 6 months, and the greatest empire in the world is at his gates. The stage is set. The players are in position. 2 empires, 2 armies, 2 visions of the world about to collide in the Nile Delta. What happens next will be decided not by courage, not by tactics, not by the number of spears or the thickness of walls. It will be decided by one man's understanding of the human soul and by Egypt's fatal love for the divine. To understand how Egypt fell, we must first understand the forces that brought Cambyses to its borders. The rise of Persia is not simply a military story. It is the story of a new kind of empire, a new philosophy of power. Before Cyrus the Great, empires were built on terror. The Assyrians ruled through calculated brutality. They flayed conquered kings alive. They built pyramids of skulls. They destroyed cities so thoroughly that not one stone remained upon another. Their message was simple: submit or be annihilated. Cyrus changed everything. He conquered with the sword, yes, but he ruled with tolerance. When he took Babylon, he freed the enslaved Jews and sent them home to Jerusalem. He respected local gods, local customs, local rulers. He did not erase cultures. He absorbed them. He turned conquered enemies into loyal subjects by giving them a stake in Persian success. The Achaemenid Empire was not held together by fear alone, but by a brilliant administrative system that made Persian rule preferable to chaos. This is what made Persia unstoppable. Previous empires burned themselves out through endless rebellions. Persia grew stronger with every conquest because it learned to rule, not merely to dominate. Egypt, by contrast, represented the old world, ancient, traditional, unchanging. For 3,000 years, Egypt had been Egypt. The same gods, the same rituals, the same fundamental worldview. This continuity was its strength, but it was also a weakness, because Egypt was not built for rapid adaptation. It was built for eternal repetition. The 26th dynasty had done what it could. Psamtik Festus Necho II and Amasis II had modernized the army, hired Greek mercenaries, built alliances. But the fundamental structure of Egyptian power remained rooted in religious authority. The pharaoh was divine. The priest controlled vast wealth and land. The people believed, with every fibre of their being, that Egypt was favoured by the gods, that the Nile would always flood, that the temples would always stand, that Egypt was eternal. This belief was about to be tested. But what sparked the war? Why did Cambyses, already ruler of the largest empire on earth, decide that Egypt must fall? The answer lies in a story of diplomatic deception, a story of wounded pride, a story that begins with a marriage proposal and ends with blood in the sand. Years before the invasion, when Cyrus still lived, Cambyses had sought an alliance with Egypt through marriage. He sent emissaries to Amasis II with a request: send one of your daughters to become the wife of the Persian prince. It was a common diplomatic practice. Royal marriages sealed alliances. They bound kingdoms together through blood and children. But Amasis was cunning. He knew what this marriage truly meant. Cambyses did not want a wife. He wanted a concubine, an Egyptian princess to parade before the Persian court as a symbol of Egypt's submission. To send his own daughter into such humiliation was unthinkable. To refuse the request of the rising Persian power was dangerous, so Amasis did what he thought was clever. He committed fraud. He took Netetis, the daughter of the dead Pharaoh Apries, the man Amasis had overthrown through bloody civil war, and dressed her in royal garments. He covered her in jewels and perfumes. He trained her in courtly manners, and he sent her to Persia as his own daughter. For a time the deception held. Netetis arrived at the Persian court. She was beautiful, tall, graceful. Cambyses received her as the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. The marriage was celebrated. The alliance seemed secure. But Netetis could not bear the lie. Perhaps she still felt loyalty to her dead father's memory. Perhaps she saw an opportunity for revenge against the man who had killed him. Perhaps she simply could not pretend any longer. Whatever her reasons, she revealed the truth to Cambyses. She told him that she was not Amasis's daughter, that she was the daughter of Apries, the pharaoh Amasis had murdered, that Amasis had sent her to Persia as a substitute, a fake princess, believing the Persians too foolish to know the difference. Cambyses was enraged. This was not merely an insult, it was a humiliation. It meant that Amasis considered Persia beneath him, that he would risk angering the greatest empire on earth rather than give his actual daughter, that he believed he could deceive the son of Cyrus the Great with impunity. The fraud cut to the core of Persian honour. It made Cambyses look weak. It made Persia look like a power that could be manipulated and mocked. And in the harsh calculus of ancient empires, perception was reality. If Egypt could deceive Persia, others would try the same. The entire structure of Persian dominance was built on the belief that defying Persia was suicide. Amasis had defied Persia and laughed. This could not stand. Cambyses swore an oath before the Persian nobles. He would invade Egypt. He would depose Amasis. He would make Egypt pay for this insult in blood. The diplomatic fraud became a death sentence for an entire civilization. But there was a problem. Invading Egypt was not like conquering other kingdoms. Between Persia and Egypt lay the Sinai Peninsula, a waterless wasteland of burning sand. Armies had died in that desert. Without a clear route, without water, without local knowledge, even the immortals could perish before they ever reached the Nile. Cambyses needed help. He needed someone who knew Egypt's secrets. He needed a traitor. And then, as if sent by the gods themselves, one arrived. His name was Phanes. He was Greek, from the city of Halicarnassus on the Anatolian coast. He was a mercenary captain, a commander of Greek troops in Egyptian service. He was intelligent, resourceful, a man who understood strategy and politics. Amasis II had trusted him, had elevated him to high rank, had made him one of the key military advisors in Egypt, and then, for reasons Herodotus himself admits he does not fully know, Phanes turned. Perhaps it was a personal insult. Perhaps Amasis had offended him in some way. damaged his pride or his purse. Perhaps Phanes simply saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to be on the winning side. Whatever the reason, Phanes of Halicarnassus made a decision that would doom Egypt. He fled. In secret, at night, he boarded a ship and sailed from Egypt. His destination was Persia. His goal was to meet Cambyses and offer his services. When Amasis learned of the betrayal, he panicked. Phanes knew everything: troop dispositions, defensive strategies, the routes through the Sinai, the locations of water sources, the weaknesses in Egypt's defences. If Phanes reached Cambyses, Egypt's secrets would be laid bare. Amasis dispatched his most trusted assassin, a royal eunuch, with orders to capture or kill Phanes before he could reach Persian territory. The chase was on. The eunuch tracked Phanes across the Mediterranean. He cornered him in Lycia, in southern Anatolia. Phanes was captured, but Phanes was cunning. He got his captors drunk. While they slept in a wine-soaked stupor, he slipped his bonds and disappeared into the night. He made his way across Anatolia to the Persian heartland, and he came before Cambyses with everything the Persian king needed to conquer Egypt. Phanes told Cambyses about the Sinai problem, but he also told him the solution. The key was the Arabs, the Bedouin tribes who controlled the desert. If Cambyses could secure their cooperation, they would provide water for the Persian army. They would guide the Persians across the wasteland. They would turn an impossible march into a viable invasion route. Cambyses sent emissaries to the Arab sheikhs with gifts and promises of friendship. The Arabs, who had no love for Egypt and saw profit in Persian alliance, agreed. They met the Persian army at the edge of the Sinai with thousands of camel skins filled with water. They guided Cambyses across the desert, from oasis to oasis, ensuring the great Persian war machine never thirsted. Thanks to Phanes, the impossible became possible. The Persian army emerged from the Sinai intact, ready for battle, and descended upon the Nile Delta like a sandstorm. But Phanes' betrayal would have a personal cost. Before leaving Egypt, he had left behind his sons. When news of his treachery reached the Egyptian camp, some of Psamtik's commanders took revenge. They brought Phanes' sons before the army. They placed a great bowl between the two armies, and then, one by one, they slit the throats of Phanes' children and drained their blood into the bowl. They mixed the blood with wine, and the Egyptian army drank it as a ritual of vengeance. Phanes would help conquer Egypt. But he would do so knowing his sons died, screaming his name, cursing him as a traitor. This was the world the Battle of Pelusium would be born into, a world of kings and betrayals, of diplomatic frauds and blood oaths, of empires colliding with the force of tectonic plates. The Persian army had crossed the uncrossable desert. They had reached the gates of Egypt, and now, at Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, the fate of the ancient world would be decided. As the Persian army approached, Psamtik III stood in Memphis, his capital, and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was coming. His advisers argued. The Greek mercenary commanders wanted to meet the Persians in the open field. The Egyptian priest council defending the holy cities. The treasury officials calculated how much gold it would take to bribe the Persians into withdrawal. And then came the report from Thebes. Rain had fallen. In Thebes. In the deep south, where rain never fell. Where the desert climate meant that years could pass without a single drop. The priests sent urgent messages. This was unprecedented. This was a sign from the gods, and it was not a good sign. In Egyptian theology, rain was foreign, unnatural. The Nile provided water. The Nile was life. Rain was what fell in strange barbarian lands. For rain to fall in Thebes, the sacred city of Amun, meant the gods were angry. It meant the divine order was disrupted. It meant Egypt had lost the favour of heaven. Psamtik knew what this meant for morale. Soldiers fight harder when they believe the gods are with them. They break when they believe the gods have turned away. The omen of rain in Thebes would spread through the army like disease. Men would whisper that Egypt was cursed, that Psamtik's ascension had angered the divine powers, that this war was already lost. But there was no choice. The Persians were coming. Ready or not, blessed or cursed, Egypt had to fight. Psamtik marched his army north to Pelusium, the fortress city on the edge of the delta, the gateway to Egypt. If Pelusium fell, the Nile Delta would be open to invasion. If Pelusium held, the Persians would be forced into a long, grinding siege that might exhaust even their resources. The Egyptian army took up positions. Greek mercenaries formed the elite corps. Egyptian infantry filled the ranks. Archers lined the walls. The fortress was strong. The defences were prepared. And in the distance, across the sandy plain, the Persian army appeared. It was vast, larger than anything the Egyptians had ever seen. Contingents from a dozen nations. Medes, Persians, Bactrians, Scythians. And at the centre, gleaming in perfect formation, the Immortals. 10,000 strong, invincible, unstoppable. The two armies faced each other across the plain of Pelusium, the greatest military power in the world against the oldest civilization in history. It should have been a clash of bronze and blood, a siege for the ages, a battle decided by courage and tactics and the strength of arms. But Cambyses had a different plan, a plan so ruthless, so psychologically devastating, that it would change the nature of a warfare forever. He was going to turn Egypt's faith into its own executioner. Cambyses stood in his command tent on the eve of battle and contemplated the nature of power. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, raised in the Persian tradition of strategic thinking. Persians did not simply fight wars. They studied their enemies. They identified weaknesses. They exploited every advantage, psychological as well as physical. And as Cambyses studied Egypt, he realized something profound. Egypt's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. The Egyptians were pious, more pious than any people on earth. They did not simply worship their gods. They structured their entire civilization around divine order. The pharaoh was a god. The priests were intermediaries with the divine. Every aspect of Egyptian life was sacred ritual. This piety had made Egypt strong for 3 millennia. It bound the people together. It gave them identity and purpose. It made them willing to die for their homeland because they believed their homeland was blessed by the gods. But what if that piety could be turned against them? What if their devotion to the divine could be made into a weapon? The Egyptians worshipped animals as sacred manifestations of divine power. This was well known. The bull god Apis, the ibis, sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom. The dog, associated with Anubis, guardian of the dead. And above all, the cat. The cat was sacred to Bastet, goddess of home, fertility and protection. To harm a cat in Egypt was not merely illegal, it was blasphemy, it was spiritual suicide. Even accidentally killing a cat could result in death. Cambyses learned all this from Phanes, from Egyptian prisoners, from merchants who had travelled the Nile. He learned that Egyptian soldiers would not harm sacred animals under any circumstances, that they would rather die than offend the gods, that their fear of divine retribution was greater than their fear of death. And in that knowledge, Cambyses saw his path to victory. According to the later Greek strategist Polyaenus, writing centuries after the event, Cambyses gave orders that must have seemed insane to his officers. He commanded his soldiers to go into the surrounding villages and countryside and capture every cat they could find, every dog, every ibis, every sheep sacred to Khnum. Bring them to the army, hundreds of them, thousands if possible. Bring them alive. The Persian soldiers obeyed, though they didn't understand. They rounded up sacred animals from Egyptian settlements. They built cages. They assembled a menagerie of divine creatures at the Persian camp. Then came the second order. Every shield in the Persian army was to be repainted. On every shield, Persian artists drew the image of Bastet, the cat goddess, staring out with divine eyes, the symbol of everything Egyptians held sacred. The Persian soldiers began to understand. Some were disturbed. This was not honourable combat. This was not the glorious clash of heroes sung about in poems. This was something else, something darker. But Cambyses was merciless. He was not interested in honour. He was interested in victory. And he had found a way to paralyse the Egyptian army without losing a single Persian soldier. On the morning of the battle, the Persians formed their lines not with shields and spears at the front, but with animals. Cats were tied to stakes and placed before the infantry. Dogs were driven forward by soldiers with whips. Ibises were caged and carried at the head of each column. The Persian soldiers raised their shields, and the image of Bastet stared across the plain at the horrified Egyptian defenders. The psychological warfare had begun. The sun rose over the Nile Delta on a spring morning in 525 BC. The Egyptian army stood in formation before the walls of Pelusium. Archers on the ramparts, infantry in ranks, Greek mercenaries holding the centre. They had trained for this. They had prepared for this. They were ready to defend their homeland with their lives. And then they saw what Cambyses had done. At first, there was confusion. Why were there animals at the front of the Persian formation? Why were cats being driven forward? What kind of strategy was this? Then understanding dawned, and with understanding came horror. The Persian army began its advance, not at a run, but slowly, deliberately, giving the Egyptians time to see, to comprehend, to understand the choice they were being forced to make. The Egyptian archers drew their bows, their commanders shouted orders to fire, to rain arrows down on the advancing Persians, to break their formation before they could close. But the archers could not release, because to fire meant to risk hitting the sacred animals. To kill a cat was to damn your soul. To slaughter an ibis was to invite the wrath of Thoth himself. And these men were not skeptics. They believed. With every fibre of their being, they believed that the gods were real and that divine punishment was certain. Some archers lowered their bows, some fired high, deliberately missing. Some tried to aim between the animals, to thread arrows through impossibly small gaps. The volley that should have shattered the Persian advance was sporadic, weak, ineffective. The Persian army kept advancing. Behind the screen of sacred animals, the immortals marched in perfect formation. They had fought Lydians and Babylonians and Scythians. They had conquered half the known world. And now they watched as the Egyptian defenders, renowned as skilled warriors, paralysed by their own faith, failed to fight back. Psamtik III stood in the Egyptian command position and watched his battle plan collapse. He screamed orders. He commanded his men to fire, to ignore the animals, to fight for Egypt. But his orders died in the throats of soldiers who could not bring themselves to commit sacrilege. The Greek mercenaries were less affected. They did not worship Bastet. Their gods were different. They could fire without spiritual agony. And they did. The Greek contingent launched volleys into the Persian ranks. Men fell. Persians screamed as bronze-tipped arrows found their marks. For a moment it seemed the Greeks might hold, but they were too few, and the psychological impact of the Egyptian paralysis was spreading. When the native Egyptian soldiers saw their own people unable to fight, saw the sacred animals being driven forward like living shields, saw the Persians desecrating everything holy with impunity, morale shattered. The Persian immortals reached the Egyptian lines. Now it was close combat, spear against spear, shield against shield, the brutal, intimate horror of ancient warfare. Men stabbed and slashed and died in the churning dust. Blood soaked into the sand. The Greek mercenaries fought with desperate fury. They were professionals who fought with lethal skill. For every Greek who fell, 2 or 3 Persians followed. The centre of the battle became a grinding meat grinder of bronze and flesh, but the Egyptian flanks collapsed. Soldiers who could not reconcile their duty to fight with their duty to the gods simply broke. Some fled. Some dropped their weapons and surrendered. Some stood paralysed, staring at the sacred animals being trampled and killed in the chaos, tears streaming down their faces, unable to process the spiritual catastrophe unfolding before them. Cambyses committed his reserves. Fresh Persian troops poured into the battle. The Greeks, isolated and surrounded, began to fall back. Their commanders screamed for the Egyptian infantry to rally, to reinforce, to do something, but the Egyptian army was finished, not beaten in combat, beaten in spirit. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter, a massacre, the nightmare that happens when one side fights and the other cannot. The Greek mercenaries, recognizing that the battle was lost, tried to organize a fighting retreat. They formed a defensive square and attempted to fall back toward Pelusium's walls. The Persians pursued. Archers fired into the packed Greek formation. Cavalry rode them down. The retreat became a rout. Hundreds of Greeks died in the fighting withdrawal. Herodotus later visited the battlefield and described seeing the bones of the dead still scattered across the sand years after the battle. He noted that the skulls of the Persian dead were thin and easily broken, while the Greek skulls were thick and strong. He attributed this to the Greeks wearing no helmets, allowing their skulls to toughen in the sun, while the Persians wore turbans that softened their bones. The observation was wrong, but the image was vivid. The battlefield at Pelusium was a charnel house. The surviving Egyptians fled toward Memphis. Psamtik himself barely escaped. His royal guard surrounded him and cut a path through the chaos. They abandoned Pelusium, abandoned the dead, abandoned any hope of defending the delta. The fortress city fell within hours. The Persian army entered Pelusium in triumph. They found the city largely intact. The civilian population had not fled, believing the fortress would hold. Now they were at the mercy of the conquerors. Cambyses, to his credit, did not permit a general massacre. He needed Egypt functional, not destroyed. But he did make examples. Egyptian commanders who had survived the battle were executed. Civilians suspected of supporting resistance were imprisoned. The city was placed under military occupation, and across the battlefield, among the scattered bones and broken shields, lay the bodies of hundreds of sacred animals. Cats, dogs, ibises, all trampled and killed in the fighting. The spiritual violation was complete. The gods had not protected them. Divine law had not saved Egypt. Faith had become the instrument of defeat. Before we continue to the fall of Memphis and the fate of Psamtik III, I want to tell you about something special. Wars in History has launched an exclusive merchandise line. Historically accurate designs, premium quality. From t-shirts featuring ancient battle formations to posters of legendary commanders, we've created something for true history enthusiasts. Check out the link in the description. Every purchase supports the channel and helps us bring you more deep dives into history's most brutal conflicts. Now, let's witness the final destruction of the Egyptian dynasty. Psamtik III retreated to Memphis with the shattered remnants of his army. Memphis, the ancient capital, the city of Ptah, the White Walls. If Egypt was to be saved, it would be saved here. The city was large, well fortified, supplied for a long siege. Perhaps the Persians, far from home, could be worn down. Perhaps allies would come. Perhaps the gods would relent. But there would be no divine intervention. The gods had been silent at Pelusium. They remained silent at Memphis. The Persian army arrived and surrounded the city. They established siege works. They cut off supply routes. They settled in for what they assumed would be a long, grinding siege. Memphis had never fallen to a foreign invader. Its walls were legendary. This would test Persian patience. Then Cambyses sent a herald, a messenger under a flag of truce by the ancient customs of warfare. The herald came before the gates of Memphis with an offer. Surrender now, and the city would be spared. Psamtik would be treated with honor. The people would not be harmed. Resist, and Memphis would be destroyed so utterly that not one stone would remain upon another. The herald never delivered his message. Someone in the Egyptian command, perhaps acting on orders, perhaps acting in rage and desperation, killed him. The herald and the 200 men of his escort were murdered. Their bodies were mutilated and thrown from the walls. When word reached Cambyses, his fury was absolute. The murder of an envoy under flag of truce was an unforgivable violation of the laws of war. It was an insult that demanded blood revenge. Any thought of mercy, any consideration of a negotiated settlement died with that herald. The siege intensified. The Persians brought up siege engines. Catapults hurled stones at the walls. Battering rams pounded the gates. Archers kept the defenders pinned down. The Persians, with the wealth of an empire behind them, could afford to bring every instrument of siegecraft to bear. Memphis held for weeks. The defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant annihilation. But there was no relief force, no allies came. The Nile could not save them. And slowly, inevitably, the walls began to crack. When the Persians finally breached the defences, the slaughter was terrible. The city fell in a day of blood and fire. Persian soldiers, enraged by the death of their herald, showed no mercy. The streets ran red. Civilians were cut down as they fled. The temples were violated. The treasuries were looted. Psamtik III was captured trying to escape through a hidden tunnel. He was dragged before Cambyses in chains. The last native pharaoh of Egypt, the heir to 3,000 years of divine kingship, reduced to a prisoner kneeling in the dust before a foreign conqueror. But Cambyses was not finished with him yet. What happened next is one of the most psychologically cruel episodes in ancient history. Cambyses did not simply execute Psamtik. He chose to break him, to destroy him not in body but in spirit. Psamtik was held in the Persian camp under guard. Cambyses ordered that the daughters of all Egyptian nobles, including Psamtik's own daughter, be dressed as slaves. They were sent to carry water jars from the Nile, performing the most menial labour, degraded and humiliated, and they were paraded before their fathers so that the Egyptian nobility would see what their rebellion had cost. Psamtik was made to watch as his daughter, a princess of Egypt, walked past him in slave's rags carrying a water jar on her shoulder. The other Egyptian nobles wept and cried out in anguish. But Psamtik remained silent. He sat on the ground, bowed his head, and stared at the earth. He did not weep. He did not cry out. He accepted this horror with stoic silence. Then came the second test. Cambyses ordered that 2,000 young Egyptian nobles, including Psamtik's son, be executed in retaliation for the murder of the Persian herald. They were led out in chains. They were forced to kneel in rows, and then, one by one, their throats were cut. Psamtik was made to watch his son die, to watch the boy bleed out in the sand. The other Egyptian fathers screamed. Some tried to rush forward and were cut down by Persian guards. Some collapsed in grief. But Psamtik remained motionless. He watched his son's execution with the same terrible silence he'd shown for his daughter's enslavement. The Persian nobles were disturbed. This was not the reaction they expected. Was the man broken? Was he mad? Why did he show no emotion? And then, as the executions ended, an old man was led through the camp. He was a beggar, one of Psamtik's former companions from better days, now reduced to poverty. The old beggar saw Psamtik in chains and cried out, begging for help, for mercy, for recognition. And at this Psamtik broke. He wept. He sobbed. He struck his head against the ground in anguish. For this beggar he showed the grief he had not shown for his daughter or his son. Cambyses, watching, was confused. He sent an officer to ask Psamtik why he had remained silent at his children's suffering but wept for a beggar. Psamtik's answer was chilling. He said that the grief of his children was too great for tears. It was beyond weeping, beyond expression. It was a wound so deep that it could not be voiced. But the suffering of the old beggar was small enough to lament, small enough to weep for. It was the answer of a man whose soul had been shattered, who had lost everything, who had watched his dynasty, his kingdom, his family destroyed in a matter of weeks, and who now existed in a realm of suffering beyond normal human emotion. Cambyses, hearing this, was apparently moved. He ordered that Psamtik be spared. The former pharaoh would live, not as a king, but as a member of Cambyses' court, a living monument to Persian victory, a reminder of what happened to those who defied the Achaemenid Empire. For a while, Psamtik lived in this strange limbo, no longer a king, not quite a slave, a ghost haunting the edges of the Persian court. But he could not accept it. Eventually he tried to foment rebellion among the Egyptians still in Persian service. He was caught, and this time Cambyses showed no mercy. According to Herodotus, Psamtik was forced to drink bull's blood, a poison in ancient belief, and died in agony. The 26th dynasty ended not with glory but with humiliation and poison. The last native pharaoh died as a failed rebel, his kingdom already a memory. Cambyses declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt. He adopted Egyptian titles. He presented himself as the legitimate heir to the throne of the two lands. And for a while he attempted to rule Egypt as a Persian province, integrating it into the vast administrative network of the Achaemenid Empire. But something went wrong. Whether it was the stress of conquest, the isolation of ruling a hostile land, or some deeper psychological break, Cambyses began to act erratically. The Greeks called it the madness of Cambyses. The most infamous incident involved the Apis bull. The Apis was a sacred bull, worshipped as a living manifestation of the god Ptah. When Cambyses returned from a failed expedition into Nubia, he found the Egyptians celebrating the arrival of a new Apis bull. In his rage and paranoia, Cambyses believed they were celebrating his failure. He went to the temple, drew his sword, and stabbed the sacred bull in the thigh. The bull died of the wound days, later. The Egyptians were horrified. To kill the Apis bull was perhaps the greatest sacrilege imaginable. It was proof that Cambyses was not a legitimate pharaoh, but a mad tyrant cursed by the gods. Whether Cambyses actually went mad, or whether this was Egyptian propaganda, is unclear. What is clear is that his reputation in Egypt was catastrophic. He was remembered not as a conqueror, but as a blasphemer, a destroyer of sacred traditions, a man who had won through dishonour and ruled through madness. Cambyses died on his way back to Persia in 522 BC, possibly by suicide, possibly from an infected wound. His death was seen by Egyptians as divine justice. The gods had finally punished the man who violated their sanctity. But the damage was done. Egypt would remain under Persian rule for over a century. The age of native pharaohs was over. Egypt, which had stood independent for 3 millennia, was now a province of a foreign empire. Its wealth flowed to Persia. Its people served foreign masters. Its gods were dishonoured in their own temples. The Battle of Pelusium had changed everything. It had proven that psychological warfare could be as devastating as any physical assault. It showed that understanding an enemy's culture could provide weapons more powerful than bronze or iron. It demonstrated that faith, which had sustained Egypt through countless invasions and disasters, could be turned into the very instrument of its defeat. The lesson echoed through history. Alexander the Great, conquering Egypt 2 centuries later, would be careful to respect Egyptian gods and present himself as a legitimate pharaoh. The Romans, ruling Egypt as a province, would maintain Egyptian religious traditions to avoid rebellion. Every subsequent conqueror understood what Cambyses had proven. Egypt could be beaten, but only if you understood the Egyptian soul. And the weapon Cambyses used? The cats and sacred animals of Pelusium? They became legend. The story was told and retold. Polyaenus, writing 700 years later, recorded it as one of the most brilliant military stratagems in history. Modern historians debate whether it actually happened, or whether it was exaggerated by Greek writers who loved a good story. But whether every detail is literally true or not, the core reality remains. Egypt fell not because its soldiers were weak, but because their beliefs were weaponized against them. The Battle of Pelusium was won in the minds of Egyptian archers who could not bring themselves to fire, in the hearts of soldiers who valued their souls more than their nation, in the moment when faith became paralysis. The battlefield at Pelusium is gone now. The sands have covered the bones. The fortress has crumbled into dust. Pelusium itself, once a great city, is an archaeological site slowly being eroded by time and the Mediterranean Sea. But the question the battle poses remains. What do you do when your deepest values become your greatest? Vulnerability. When the things you hold most sacred are used as weapons against you. When the choice is between damnation and destruction. The Egyptian archers at Pelusium faced an impossible choice. Fire and damn their souls. Hold and watch their nation die. They chose their souls, and Egypt fell. Was that the right choice? History does not answer moral questions. It only records consequences. The consequence of Pelusium was the end of native Egyptian rule. The consequence was 3,000 years of independence erased in a single day. The consequence was that faith, which had been Egypt's strength, proved to be its fatal weakness when facing an enemy ruthless enough to exploit it. Cambyses won through brilliance, yes, but also through a willingness to violate every norm of honourable warfare. He used the sacred as a shield. He turned religion into a weapon. He proved that in war nothing is too sacred to weaponize, that victory goes not to the righteous but to the ruthless. That, understanding your enemy's soul gives you the power to destroy them without ever landing a blow. This is the brutal truth of Pelusium. This is why the battle matters. Not because of the tactics or the numbers or even the outcome, but because of what it revealed about the nature of conflict. That war is not merely physical but psychological. That the mind is the ultimate battlefield. That culture itself can be turned into a weapon. We live in an age of psychological warfare, of information operations and cultural conflict, of battles fought not with swords but with narratives and symbols and the manipulation of belief. The techniques have changed. The technology has advanced. But the fundamental principle Cambyses understood in 525 BC remains true. If you understand what your enemy believes, what they value, what they cannot bring themselves to violate, you can defeat them without ever drawing a sword. The cats of Pelusium conquered Egypt not through strength but through faith. Not through claws but through the minds of men who believed the gods were watching. And in that moment, on that blood-soaked delta, the ancient world learned a lesson that echoes through every conflict since. Your beliefs can save you, but they can also damn you. The question is whether you understand them well enough to defend them, and whether your enemies understand them well enough to use them against you. This was the day cats conquered Egypt. This was the Battle of Pelusium. This was the moment faith became a weapon, and an empire died still holding its moral ground while the enemy trampled over it. Remember the Egyptian archers. Remember their choice. Remember what it cost. And ask yourself, when the moment comes, when your deepest values are weaponized against you, what will you choose? Your soul or your survival? Your faith or your nation? Damnation or destruction? That is the question Pelusium asks across 25 centuries, and history still waits for an answer. This is the kind of deep psychological analysis of warfare you'll only find here on Wars in History. If you want more content like this, if you want to understand not just what happened but why it matters, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support lets us spend weeks researching these videos, diving into primary sources, and bringing you the brutal truths of history that other channels won't touch. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but human nature does. See you in the next war.